Ever notice how the strangest decisions in life happen on the nights when the road simply refuses to let you keep driving? The snow started falling just outside Lincoln, Nebraska, quiet at first, then thick enough to turn the interstate into a slow ribbon of red brake lights stretching for miles. By the time Marcus Hale eased his aging Ford pickup off exit 312, the storm had already swallowed the sky. Wind pushed across the empty gas station lot in sharp bursts, rattling the metal sign above a small roadside motel that looked like it had been standing there since before Marcus was born. The place was called Prairie Lantern Lodge, though there wasn't much lantern about it tonight except a flickering yellow bulb over the front door. Marcus shut off the engine and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the heater tick quietly as it cooled. He checked the time on the dashboard clock. 9:47 p.m. Back in Kansas City, his 7-year-old son Ethan would already be asleep, probably curled up with the dinosaur blanket he refused to give up. Marcus reached for his phone, glanced at the wallpaper photo of Ethan missing his 2 front teeth, and smiled just slightly before stepping out into the cold. The snow crunched under his boots as he crossed the parking lot, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. Inside the motel lobby, the air smelled faintly like old coffee and pine cleaner. A space heater hummed behind the front desk, where a tired clerk flipped through a paperback novel. But Marcus wasn't the only traveler seeking shelter from the storm. Standing at the counter ahead of him was a woman who didn't seem to belong anywhere near a roadside motel. Her coat alone probably cost more than Marcus had spent on his truck. Tailored wool, charcoal gray. Her posture straight, shoulders steady, like someone used to walking into rooms where everyone else stood up when she entered. Victoria Sterling didn't turn around right away, but the room seemed to bend slightly around her presence. The clerk cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the storm filled everything up fast tonight." Victoria's voice was calm, controlled, the kind of voice that usually made people stop talking. "Then I'll take whatever room you have left." The clerk hesitated. "That's the thing, there's only one." Marcus stepped forward quietly, brushing snow from his sleeve. "Same here," he said, polite, not pushing ahead, just stating a fact. The clerk looked between them like a man standing between 2 trains on the same track. "Just one room left in the building," he repeated. The wind outside howled against the windows as if to underline the problem. Victoria finally turned. For a second her eyes scanned Marcus the way executives scan a contract. Quick, precise, measuring. She saw the worn leather jacket, the work boots dusted with highway salt, the tired pickup through the glass. Marcus met her gaze without challenge, calm the way a man learns to be when life doesn't leave room for unnecessary tension. The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "I guess one of you will have to find another place down the road." Marcus glanced back through the lobby window at the swirling snow burying the highway signs. There wasn't another place down the road. Not tonight. Victoria seemed to realize the same thing at the exact same moment. She exhaled slowly, the decision forming in her mind the way business decisions always did. Quick, logical, efficient. Then she looked directly at Marcus and said something that made the clerk nearly drop his pen. "Why waste money on 2 rooms?" The heater hummed. The storm rattled the windows. And for the first time that night, Marcus Hale allowed the faintest hint of curiosity to cross his face. For a moment, the small motel lobby became very quiet, the kind of quiet that makes people suddenly aware of every little sound in the room. The space heater hummed softly beside the counter. Snow tapped against the windows like handfuls of sand. The clerk blinked twice, as if he had not heard the sentence correctly the first time. Marcus Hale did not speak right away. He simply looked at the woman in front of him, studying the calm certainty in her expression. Victoria Sterling did not smile when she said it. There was no hint of humor in her voice. To her, it was simply a practical solution, the kind someone arrived at after years of solving problems quickly and moving on. She rested one hand lightly on the polished counter, fingers steady, posture composed. "The storm will last all night," she added after a second. "And this place has exactly 1 room left. It is simple math." The clerk looked from her to Marcus again, waiting for the awkward refusal he expected. In his mind, the situation probably looked ridiculous. A sharply dressed executive sharing a roadside motel room with a man who had just walked in wearing a work jacket dusted with highway snow. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck slowly, more thoughtful than uncomfortable. Through the window behind them, he could see the parking lot disappearing under a blanket of white. The highway signs across the road were already fading behind the storm. Driving again tonight would not be smart. Maybe not even safe. He turned his attention back to Victoria. She held his gaze without impatience, as if she were waiting for a business partner to consider a proposal. Marcus noticed the small details most people would miss. The faint tension at the edge of her shoulders. The slight crease between her eyebrows that suggested she had been thinking hard all day before the storm forced her off the road. She looked tired, though she carried it well. Marcus finally gave a small nod. "You are right." The clerk's pen slipped from his fingers and tapped the counter. Marcus continued speaking in the same steady tone he used with everyone. No sense wasting money. Victoria studied him again, perhaps expecting hesitation or a joke that never came. Instead, she found something simpler. Calm agreement. Nothing more. Nothing less. The clerk cleared his throat and reached for the registration book. "All right then," he said cautiously. "One room." The old motel computer beeped as he typed. Outside, the wind howled harder, rattling the loose sign above the entrance. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket for his wallet, but Victoria lifted a hand slightly before he could place it on the counter. "I will cover it," she said. Marcus shook his head once, gentle but firm. "Half is fair." For a brief second, the corner of Victoria's mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile, but something close to recognition. She gave a small nod. The clerk handed them a brass key attached to a plastic tag with the number 12 printed in faded red. "End of the hall," he said. Marcus picked up his duffel bag, while Victoria lifted her small leather suitcase. They walked toward the hallway without another word. The corridor lights buzzed faintly overhead. The carpet was old but clean. Somewhere down the hall an ice machine rattled. When they reached the door marked 12, Marcus stepped aside automatically, so she could enter first. Victoria paused just long enough to notice the gesture. Not dramatic. Not performative. Just quiet courtesy from a man who seemed entirely comfortable being exactly who he was. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was simple. One bed, one chair, one narrow window filled with swirling snow outside. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment, then glanced back at Marcus as if measuring the strange situation once more. Neither of them had planned to end the night here, but the storm had other ideas. Marcus stepped inside after her, closing the door gently behind him as the storm roared across the motel parking lot outside. The sound of the wind pressed faintly through the thin walls, a steady reminder that neither of them had many other options tonight. The room was exactly what one would expect from a roadside place built decades earlier. One queen-sized bed sat against the far wall with a quilt that looked recently washed but well used. A small wooden desk leaned beneath the window, and beside it stood a single padded chair with fabric that had faded from years of travelers passing through. A coffee maker rested on the dresser beside 2 wrapped paper cups. The heater near the wall clicked on with a low rumble, pushing warm air slowly into the room. Victoria rolled her suitcase inside and paused near the bed, scanning the space the way someone used to executive boardrooms evaluated a situation. Marcus set his duffel bag near the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar. Outside, a truck passed on the highway and its headlights slid briefly across the ceiling before disappearing into the storm. Marcus glanced toward the chair near the desk, then toward the bed, measuring the room the way a man quietly solved a small puzzle. Without comment, he walked over to the chair and lifted it slightly, turning it so it faced the door instead of the desk. Then he placed his duffel bag beside it. Victoria noticed the movement immediately. She folded her arms loosely, watching him with growing curiosity. Marcus unzipped his bag and pulled out a folded sweatshirt, placing it across the back of the chair like a makeshift cushion. He moved with calm efficiency, not dramatic, not awkward, simply practical. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You are not taking the bed," she said. Marcus shook his head once, already settling the arrangement in his mind. "You drove longer than I did," he replied. "Besides, that chair looks comfortable enough." Victoria glanced at the chair. It clearly was not. The cushion had thinned with age, and the wooden arms carried small scratches from years of use. She looked back at him. That was not the agreement. Marcus gave a small shrug. The agreement was sharing the room. He sat down in the chair briefly to test it, leaning back as if proving his point. The heater hummed again, and warm air brushed across the room. Victoria studied him in silence. Most men she encountered in her world reacted to unexpected proximity in one of two ways. Some tried too hard to impress her. Others became nervous, unsure how to act around someone whose name appeared in financial magazines and corporate reports. Marcus Hale seemed to do neither. He simply behaved like a man who had already decided what kind of person he intended to be long before tonight began. Marcus pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and glanced at the time again. 10:23. He hesitated a second before pressing the call button. Victoria looked away politely toward the window, but the quiet room carried his voice easily. "Hey, champ," Marcus said softly when the call connected. His tone shifted in a way that made the room feel different. "Warmer. Did you brush your teeth like we talked about?" A small child's voice crackled faintly through the speaker, too distant to understand clearly, but energetic enough to bring a faint smile to Marcus's face. "Good," Marcus said. "Then you are already ahead of me tonight." Victoria remained by the window, watching the storm swirl under the parking lot lights while Marcus spoke quietly with his son. Something about the scene did not fit the expectations she had formed earlier in the lobby. The man sitting in the worn motel chair was not trying to prove anything. He was simply checking on the most important person in his world. And for reasons she did not yet understand, that small detail made the room feel less strange than it had a few minutes earlier. Marcus ended the call with a quiet promise that he would see Ethan in 2 days if the weather cleared and the roads opened again. When the phone screen dimmed, he sat for a moment in the chair, listening to the steady hum of the heater and the distant wind brushing against the motel walls. The conversation with his son had left a calm warmth in the room that had not been there before. Victoria had not turned around during the call. She stood near the window watching the storm drift across the empty parking lot, arms loosely crossed, but she had heard enough to understand the tone in Marcus's voice. There had been patience there, familiarity, the quiet rhythm of a father who had repeated the same small bedtime questions many times before. Marcus placed his phone on the small desk and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "He likes to pretend he stays up late," he said after a moment, not looking directly at her, but speaking naturally into the quiet room. "But he falls asleep halfway through his dinosaur books every night." Victoria turned slightly at that. The faintest hint of amusement touched her expression. "How old?" she asked. 7, Marcus replied. "Second grade. Thinks the world runs on pancakes and science projects." The wind pushed harder against the window, and a swirl of snow raced past the glass. Victoria looked at the storm again before speaking. "You travel for work?" Marcus nodded. "Maintenance supervisor for a hospital network. When equipment breaks, someone has to drive out and fix it." He paused briefly before adding, "Not very glamorous." Victoria leaned lightly against the desk, considering the answer. "Hospitals keep people alive," she said calmly. "That sounds fairly important." Marcus let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Machines help. People do the real work." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt easier, as if the edges of the situation had softened slightly. Victoria removed her coat and folded it neatly across the back of the bed. Beneath it she wore a simple navy sweater and slacks that carried the quiet precision of someone accustomed to long workdays. She sat on the edge of the mattress and slipped off her shoes, placing them carefully beside the nightstand. Marcus noticed how deliberate her movements were. Even small actions carried the control of someone used to managing entire boardrooms. Victoria glanced toward the chair where Marcus sat. "You should take the bed for part of the night at least," she said. Marcus shook his head gently. "I will be fine here." He leaned back slightly in the chair again, the wooden frame creaking softly under the shift of weight. Victoria studied him for a long moment, trying to understand the steady boundary he had placed between them without saying it out loud. In her world, most people adjusted their behavior quickly around power, money, or status. Marcus had not asked what company she ran. He had not tried to impress her, or even seemed particularly curious about who she was. He had simply chosen the chair and settled into it, as if the decision required no discussion. Victoria lay back against the pillows and stared up at the ceiling where the passing headlights occasionally traced pale shapes across the plaster. "You trust strangers easily," she said after a moment. Marcus looked toward the door, then toward the quiet hallway beyond it. "Not exactly," he replied. but storms make people honest. Victoria turned her head slightly, curious. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful shrug. When the road shuts down and everyone ends up in the same place, you learn quickly who people really are. The heater clicked again, and the room filled with a gentle wave of warmth. Outside, the storm continued to fall across the empty highway. But inside the small motel room, two strangers sat in a silence that no longer felt quite as strange as it had an hour earlier. The storm did not slow down as the night deepened. Snow continued to sweep across the parking lot lights outside, turning the world beyond the window into a soft white blur. Inside the room, the heater kept working steadily, filling the small space with a gentle warmth that made the quiet feel almost comfortable. Marcus remained in the chair near the door, leaning back slightly with his arms folded loosely across his chest. His breathing had settled into a calm rhythm that suggested he had learned long ago how to rest anywhere when the day finally ended. Victoria, however, did not seem as ready for sleep. She turned onto her side, then onto her back again, eyes open as she stared at the faint shadows drifting across the ceiling. After several minutes, she sat up slowly, swinging her legs off the edge of the bed. Marcus noticed the movement, but did not speak right away. Victoria walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside a few inches. The highway beyond the motel looked deserted now, buried beneath a steady blanket of white. She let the curtain fall back into place and stood there quietly, as if the stillness of the storm had stirred thoughts she had been carrying for a long time. Marcus spoke gently from the chair. "Long day." Victoria let out a slow breath. "Long week," she replied. Her voice carried none of the sharp confidence she had shown in the lobby earlier. Instead, there was a trace of fatigue beneath it, the kind that did not come from lack of sleep, but from too many decisions stacking on top of each other. Marcus nodded slightly, even though she was not looking at him. "Storm probably forced half the state to slow down tonight," he said. "Not always a bad thing." Victoria turned toward him, leaning lightly against the desk. "You say that like slowing down is easy." Marcus thought about that for a second before answering. "Not easy," he said. "Just necessary sometimes." Victoria studied him with quiet curiosity. The chair he sat in was still clearly uncomfortable, yet he had not complained once. The man seemed to carry a steady calm that did not match the chaos most people felt when plans fell apart. "You do not seem worried about tomorrow," she said. Marcus shrugged gently. "Tomorrow will come whether I worry about it or not." Victoria gave a faint, tired smile at that. She walked to the coffee maker and filled one of the paper cups with water from the sink. The faucet made a soft rushing sound that filled the room for a moment. When she turned back, she noticed Marcus watching the snow through the narrow window. His posture was relaxed, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes. "You travel often," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "More than I used to." "Because of your job?" she asked. Marcus paused briefly before answering. "Because life changed a few years ago." Victoria did not press further. Something in his tone suggested that the sentence carried more weight than he wanted to unpack tonight. Instead, she took a small sip of water and leaned against the desk again. The quiet stretched for a moment longer before she spoke again. "Most people would have asked by now," she said. Marcus looked over at her. "Asked what?" Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Who I am." Marcus considered the question for a moment, then gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. "Storm put us in the same room," he replied calmly. "But that does not mean I need to read your resume tonight." The answer surprised her. For the first time since the evening began, Victoria Sterling laughed softly, the sound quiet but genuine. And somewhere in that simple moment, the invisible distance between two strangers became just a little smaller. Victoria's quiet laughter faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt warmer than before. For a moment, she simply stood there beside the desk, one hand resting lightly against the wood, as if she was adjusting to the unfamiliar ease of the conversation. Outside, the storm continued to move across the dark highway, but inside the room the atmosphere had softened. Marcus shifted slightly in the chair, stretching his shoulders after sitting still for so long. The wooden frame creaked quietly beneath him. Victoria noticed the sound and glanced toward the chair again. "That thing cannot possibly be comfortable," she said. Marcus looked down at it briefly, then back at her. "It is not terrible," he replied calmly. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a very polite way of saying the opposite." Marcus allowed a small smile. "I have slept in worse places." Victoria considered that answer with curiosity. Military? She asked. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, just life. The room settled again into a thoughtful quiet. Victoria returned to the edge of the bed and sat down, pulling the blanket slightly closer around her legs. The storm outside made the motel feel strangely removed from the rest of the world, like a small island of light surrounded by miles of snow. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees again. You should try to get some rest, he said gently. Victoria looked toward the window where the snow continued to swirl under the parking lot lights. I usually answer emails at this hour, she said, or prepare for meetings in the morning. Marcus nodded once. Sounds busy. Victoria gave a faint exhale that carried both humor and exhaustion. Busy is one word for it. She looked at him again, studying the calm way he occupied the small space. You do not seem curious about what I do. Marcus thought about that for a moment before answering. I assume it is something important, he said. You carry yourself like someone who has a lot of responsibility. Victoria tilted her head slightly. And that does not make you curious? Marcus shrugged gently. People tell you who they are if you listen long enough. Victoria watched him carefully after that. The answer did not sound rehearsed. It sounded like something he had learned slowly over time. She leaned back against the pillows again, folding one arm beneath her head. Responsibility is an interesting word, she said quietly. Marcus looked toward her. Victoria's gaze drifted toward the ceiling again as she spoke. Thousands of employees depend on the company I run. Investors expect growth every quarter. Every decision has consequences that ripple through a lot of lives. Her voice was calm, but the weight of the words lingered in the room. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding more than she might have expected. That sounds heavy. Victoria gave a small, thoughtful smile at that simple description. Heavy is also a good word. The heater hummed softly again, pushing warm air across the room. Marcus leaned back in the chair, watching the shadows move along the wall. My world is smaller, he said after a moment. Victoria turned her head toward him. Marcus looked down at his hands before continuing. Most days my biggest decision is how to keep a machine running so a hospital floor stays warm or a surgery room has power. Victoria listened quietly. Marcus lifted his eyes again. But at the end of the day there is still someone waiting at home who thinks I am the most important person in the world. The words hung gently in the quiet room. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression softer now than it had been when they first met. For someone who spent most of her days surrounded by influence and pressure, the simple certainty in Marcus's voice carried a kind of strength she did not often hear. Outside, the storm continued to cover the empty highway in silence. But inside the small motel room the distance between two strangers had quietly begun to disappear. The quiet that followed Marcus's words settled over the room like the falling snow outside, soft and steady. Victoria did not respond right away. She remained lying against the pillows, one arm resting across her stomach as she looked toward the ceiling, but her thoughts had clearly shifted somewhere deeper than the conversation itself. For years her nights had ended inside quiet penthouse apartments or high-rise hotels, the kind of places where silence usually meant emails waiting or financial projections still unfinished. Tonight the silence felt different. There was no buzzing phone, no late meeting waiting on the other side of midnight. Just the low hum of the heater and the sound of wind moving across an empty Nebraska highway. Marcus leaned back further into the chair, adjusting the folded sweatshirt behind his shoulders to make it slightly more comfortable. His posture carried the relaxed patience of someone who had learned how to sit still without feeling restless. Victoria turned her head slightly and looked toward him. The dim lamp beside the bed cast a soft light across the room, and for the first time, she studied his face without the guarded evaluation she usually used when meeting someone new. There was a calm steadiness there that did not come from confidence alone. It looked more like the result of years spent carrying responsibilities quietly. Your son, she said after a moment, her voice softer now. He sounds like he trusts you a lot. Marcus gave a small nod. Children notice more than people think. Victoria sat up a little, resting her back against the headboard. That is true. She paused briefly, choosing her next words more carefully. Most of the people in my world measure success by numbers. Revenue, market share, quarterly growth. Marcus listened quietly. Victoria looked down at her hands for a moment before continuing. But none of those numbers mean anything to a 7-year-old. Marcus allowed a faint smile. No, he said. To him, success means I show up when I say I will. The sentence hung gently in the air between them. Victoria leaned her head back against the wall again, considering it. Somewhere outside, a gust of wind pushed snow against the motel door, and the building creaked softly in response. She spoke again after a long pause. You said life changed a few years ago. Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked toward the window where the snow continued to fall under the dim parking lot light. His expression remained calm, but something thoughtful passed through his eyes. My wife passed away, he said quietly after a moment. Victoria's posture straightened slightly, the weight of the statement reaching her instantly. Marcus continued in the same steady tone, not dramatic, not bitter. Ethan was 4 at the time. Victoria did not interrupt. Marcus rested his hands loosely together as he spoke. That is when you learn very quickly what matters and what does not. The room fell silent again. Victoria studied him carefully, seeing him now through a clearer lens than before. The calm steadiness she had noticed earlier suddenly made more sense. It was not just patience. It was resilience. Marcus finally glanced toward her again and gave a small shrug, almost apologetic for the heaviness of the topic. But kids are stronger than we think, he added gently. They remind you to keep moving forward. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing the quiet strength in his voice. For someone who had spent years surrounded by ambition and competition, the simple clarity of Marcus Hale's priorities felt strangely grounding. Outside, the storm continued its slow work across the frozen highway, but inside the small motel room the night had become something neither of them had expected when they first stepped out of the snow. Victoria remained quiet for a long moment after Marcus finished speaking. The heater hummed softly in the background while the storm continued its slow sweep across the dark highway outside. She had spent years mastering the ability to control conversations, to guide discussions in boardrooms where millions of dollars could change direction with a single sentence. But tonight she found herself without anything strategic to say. The truth Marcus had spoken carried no drama, yet it settled into the room with a weight that numbers and contracts never could. Victoria looked down at her hands resting on the blanket. They were steady, the same hands that signed acquisition agreements and directed entire departments across multiple states. But suddenly those achievements felt strangely distant in comparison to the simple image of a man sitting in a worn motel chair because he believed his son deserved the bed more than he did. Marcus shifted slightly in the chair, stretching his legs a little to ease the stiffness. He glanced toward the window where the snowfall had begun to slow, though the road remained completely covered. Looks like the storm might calm down by morning, he said quietly. Victoria nodded, though her thoughts were somewhere else. She studied Marcus again, not as a passing traveler this time, but as someone whose life had been shaped by choices she had never needed to face. You never remarried, she said gently after a moment, more as an observation than a question. Marcus shook his head once. No, he did not elaborate immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands for a second, as if measuring how much of the story needed to be told. Life became pretty full with Ethan, he said calmly. Victoria leaned back against the headboard again, listening carefully. Marcus continued in the same steady tone he had carried all evening. Children notice who shows up and who does not. I did not want him wondering if he came second to anything else. The words were simple, but they carried a quiet conviction that lingered in the room. Victoria let out a slow breath. In her world, people often spoke about priorities, yet those priorities shifted quickly when opportunities appeared. Marcus seemed to operate by a different set of rules entirely. She looked toward the chair again, noticing the way he remained comfortably settled even in a place most people would consider inconvenient. You said earlier that storms make people honest, she said. Marcus nodded slightly. Sometimes the road strips away everything that usually distracts us. Victoria considered that. She thought about the endless pace of her company, the pressure of shareholders, the constant race toward expansion that had defined her life for the past decade. For the first time in a very long while, she had nowhere to go and nothing urgent demanding her attention. The stillness of the moment felt almost unfamiliar. Marcus leaned forward again, resting his arms on his knees. You should try to sleep, he said gently. Morning will come faster than you expect. Victoria studied him for a second longer before slowly lowering herself back against the pillows. The lamp beside the bed cast a soft circle of light across the room, leaving Marcus mostly in shadow near the door. Yet even in that dim light, she could sense the steady calm in his presence. "Marcus," she said quietly. He looked up. Victoria hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "Most people I meet try to impress me within the first 5 minutes." Marcus tilted his head slightly, curious but patient. Victoria gave a faint smile that carried both honesty and surprise. "You did not try at all." Marcus considered that for a second, then gave a small shrug that seemed almost effortless. "I figured the storm already did the introductions." Victoria let out a soft laugh again and closed her eyes, the sound of it lighter than any moment she had experienced earlier that evening. And somewhere in that quiet motel room, with snow still drifting gently across the highway outside, Victoria Sterling began to realize that the calm man in the worn chair had already impressed her more than he probably understood. Morning arrived quietly over the Prairie Lantern Lodge. The storm had finally passed during the early hours before sunrise, leaving the world outside covered in a smooth white blanket that reflected the pale winter light. The highway that had been swallowed by snow the night before now stretched across the horizon in long silent lines, freshly plowed, but still nearly empty. Inside the small motel room, the heater had fallen silent, its work finished sometime before dawn. Marcus Hale opened his eyes slowly in the chair near the door, his body stiff but rested enough after the long night. For a moment he simply sat there, listening to the calm that had replaced the storm. The quiet felt different now, lighter. He glanced toward the window and saw the soft glow of morning slipping through the curtains. Marcus stood carefully so the chair would not creak too loudly. Victoria Sterling was still asleep on the bed, one arm resting lightly across the blanket, the tension that had followed her through most of the night finally gone from her face. For the first time since he had met her, she looked less like a chief executive carrying the weight of an entire corporation and more like someone who had simply needed a night of uninterrupted rest. Marcus picked up his duffel bag and moved quietly toward the small desk near the door. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. 6:22 in the morning. Early enough to get back on the road before the traffic returned. He glanced once more toward the bed before reaching for a small notepad beside the motel phone. The pen scratched softly across the paper as he wrote a single line in careful letters. When he finished, he folded the page once and placed it beside the lamp where she would see it easily. Marcus slipped on his jacket, lifted his duffel bag over one shoulder, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he paused for a moment, looking back at the quiet room where the storm had brought two strangers together for a few unexpected hours. Victoria stirred slightly in her sleep, but did not wake. Marcus opened the door gently and stepped into the hallway, closing it with the softest click. Downstairs, the motel lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee. The clerk from the night before nodded as Marcus passed the counter. Outside, the morning air was cold and bright, the sky clearing into a pale blue above the snow-covered fields. Marcus brushed a thin layer of frost from the windshield of his truck and climbed inside. The engine started with a low rumble, sending a small cloud of exhaust into the crisp Nebraska air. He drove out of the parking lot slowly, tires crunching across the fresh snow before turning onto the quiet highway. Back in room 12, the sunlight crept gradually across the bed until it reached Victoria's face. She blinked awake slowly, her mind taking a moment to remember where she was. The events of the previous night returned in quiet fragments. The storm, the motel, the calm man in the chair by the door. Victoria sat up and looked across the room. The chair was empty now, the folded sweatshirt gone. For a brief second, she felt an unexpected stillness settle in her chest. Then her eyes fell on the folded note beside the lamp. She reached for it and opened the page. The handwriting was steady and simple. "Thank you for trusting a stranger." Victoria held the note in her hand for a moment, reading the sentence again as the morning sunlight filled the room. Outside, the road stretched forward across miles of open land. And somewhere along that road, Marcus Hale was already heading back toward the small boy who believed he was the most important man in the world.